Don't fuck up. Don't fuck yourself. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Rude Cooking School podcast. I'm your host, John Hauser III. And with me this week, we have a special guest. He's a chef. He's a caterer. He's a historian. He's a lover of chess and of rock climbing. It's Chef Jay Reifel. Hey, man, how you doing?
Excellent. That was not the intro I was expecting.
Well, I was going to be like, hater of sports, but then you started naming sports that you liked. Oh,
No.
Also lover of sumo wrestling, right? Yeah.
I do adore sumo wrestling in a very strange way.
How did that start? Did you spend time in Japan?
No, I briefly grew up in Hawaii for a while.
Oh, okay.
And it would be on the TV and you would also just kind of watch in strange fascination. And then I started watching it again like 5 or 6 years ago. It was also at the time, it was a sport that had one of the most dominant figures in sports history in it, which made it kind of fun to watch this, someone who was so far and above everyone else, who's now retired.
I forget his name. I know exactly who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was, and I got into that. And there was also my favorite guy, who was the smallest top division, excellent sumo wrestler whose name's Enho. And I'm totally obsessed with him. He's of course horribly injured now, but he's fighting his way up to top division. So we'll see.
Yeah, I've caught myself late night watching sumo wrestling, and it's amazing. Like I was sitting with my son maybe a few months ago, and it was on, and we were just watching it. I'm like, okay, so as best as I know, they're trying to push each other out of that circle. Once they get out of the circle, the match is over. Is that probably
there's basically only two things. You either push the other person out of the circle or you cause any part of their body except their feet to touch the ground.
Okay.
And that's it. And there are no weight classes. And it's one of those weird things that if you watch it a bunch, all of a sudden it clicks and you start to see like the extraordinary subtlety and the amazing like grace and power of these people that, if you know nothing about it, you look at it and think that's a big fat guy, but
right.
Whatever.
No, it's learning how to, push weight, control your own weight. Yeah. It, like you said, it's subtle things that, normal people, it's not gonna. Yeah.
It also has all these like very weird, like crazinesses too, all down to like each stable has their own stew, which is cool, and like that's their their secret stew,
the thing that they feed the guys,
which is and then they eat enormous amounts of rice. And I find it all just kind of I find a lot of odd things very fascinating, which is probably how I ended up in this whole historical cooking world.
So let's get on to that. You are co-author of the book, A History of the World in 10 Dinners, correct?
Yes.
And your writing partner, so what do you, so it's Victoria Flexner,
yes,
right? Is she your writing partner or is she the other historian?
Yeah, she's more a straight historian and food historian, and yes. I have a chef's background, so I do you could call it historical reenactment cooking.
She's front of the house, you're back of the house.
Sure.
When you guys do the dinners, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean,
you come out.
It's kind of both. We both come out and talk about stuff. And,
oh, good. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
No, I come out and I do my little food history bits and get a laugh, and then I go back in the kitchen.
So let's go back to that. How did you guys get started doing the dinners? Like, what was it? Chicken and egg first dinners, then book?
No, it was definitely dinners first. She kind of had this idea of doing these historical dinners, and she was looking for a chef to do them with. And there's lots of people who can cook, and there's lots of people who understand history. There's not a ton of people who are really passionate about cooking and really passionate about history and really like doing weird research. And I'm kind of a weird combination of things. Like I've always looked at even food in this kind of strangely narrative way. So yeah, I'm just kind of the right guy to do this for all sorts of odd reasons, I think. But
yeah, it's interesting because I know a bunch of chefs, and some of them, the ones I find the more interesting ones are the ones who give a shit about the the history of things, and like the uber nerds that are like, well, actually on page 371 of Escoffier, you get those guys and stuff. But I always find the history obviously really fascinating. I wouldn't have this podcast if I didn't. But yeah, so she found, you guys met up and found each other.
Yes.
And then you started doing them. So can you explain what the dinners are?
So basically we pick a period in history, and we kind of consider food as the gateway drug to history. So we pick a period in history and we create a menu that allows us to talk about like the salient features of that time, and not just what the foods are, but like there's, we did, one of our early classes was the medieval Silk Road, which is really, you could talk about like the birth of globalism almost, right? Mm-hmm. So you're working from original sources, which is kind of a rule. Like I only cook from an actual, some kind of text or scholarly literature that exists, and then I try to be faithful to that. Like I'm not trying to do interpretations.
The bibliography for the book is fucking nuts. It's so cool. Yeah, totally.
I mean, we live in an incredible time. Like, we're so lucky that if I was trying to do this 20 years ago, I would spend all my time in archives and trying to fly around the world. And now, I mean, like, again, I have to shout out to the translators. These people who it's a real labor of love. There's not a ton of money in translating really long historical documents, but there's these people. Nawal Nasrallah is one I always give a shout out to because she's tremendous. But all the translators that I worked with, these are also people that if you have a question and you email them, they will get back to you.
Right.
Like, they're like the most wonderful giving people. It's just awesome. And it's made it incredibly easy, because I only speak a couple languages and there's something like 14 languages represented in the book. I forget exactly how many, depending on also whether like Middle English is a language, for example.
Yeah.
But it's a very strange little like world that I stumbled into, but it's worked out really well.
It's super cool. So like, all right, you guys are cooking from source books. Like,
yes.
One, the book is amazing. Like, I was going through the book for the past few days. It's really rich. There's a lot to uncover. The asides are great. There are little asides, there's like, oh, by the way,
those I write. So all the, like, those are all the kind of the funny bits that are in the boxes. Those, I read
that's
all
what I
figured
because there's a different voice.
Yeah, there's definitely
little
two different voices in the book.
Yeah. So like, and it's funny because I'm like, oh, that's kind of how I write, like with silly asides and stuff like that. But the way that's broken down, there's the breakdown of like, okay, here's the Silk Road. It's not really a road. It was part sea and part land, and nobody really traveled the whole thing. It was 7,000 plus miles. Like, it really goes into what it is, and it's really cool. And then, breaking down like, okay, Baghdad was a pretty central place in the medieval times. The money would show up in England all the time, stuff like that. And then it would get into the recipes. By the way, the recipes are broken down. They're really easy to read.
Thank you.
The way that they're put together is really easy. Like, I try to always look at new cookbooks as a person who hasn't cooked.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because some of the recipes are very involved. Like, whether you're new or whether you're very good at cooking, there's something for everybody. And
some are very different. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Some of the recipes are very, very difficult, and some of the recipes just ask you to do things that you would never have thought of.
We'll get into the big one in a bit.
Yeah, one way or another. And
we all know the big one in the book, right? Like, so the way everything's broken down is really like, even if it's a difficult recipe, it's easy to follow, which is it's good. It's good recipe writing.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful editor to work with, like who was really, really, and by the end of writing the book, I had really figured out how to do it. I mean, it's very hard to figure out how much detail to include and what to include and what not to include. And, I consider this a book written for a experienced home cook. There's stuff that, a not very experienced person can take a shot at.
Absolutely.
There's stuff that is really challenging, even for a, particularly, talented or experienced cook, particularly some of the odder pastry stuff. I'll be honest, the most difficult recipe in the book and the most difficult recipe to test, and it was the one I probably cooked 15 or 20 times to get right, is the recipe for injera from the Ethiopian chapter, because that's a very weird, injera is like this spongy bread that's both the utensil and the plate, and it's just fundamental to Ethiopian cuisine. And the way the vast majority of people who learn how to cook injera is by sitting at the elbow of their mother or aunt or grandmother, and just learning the steps and the textures, because the texture is so important. And I would bet that most people who make injera don't know why some of the steps are important. Like I wasted a lot of food science time figuring it out, but they just know that it works. Like I still can't pour that nice spiral the way people who do it every day. It's really hard.
Yeah.
But when you nail it and you get it right, it's one of those incredibly satisfying moments,
Yo, yeah, totally. And yeah, injera's like, it's so good. But when you get bad injera, you're like, oh man.
Yeah, it's like cracked, or it's like spongy and mushy, not spongy and bouncy.
Fluffy,
yeah. It's very tricky. I mean, I can get into the food. I mean, if you're interested, I can tell you why injera is so hard. But it's because
hit on it.
It's because teff flour, which is what injera is made from, has extremely low protein. It's extremely high in starch, and the protein is what actually gives the starch something to bind to. So it's very, very hard to hydrate that starch. That's why, and mine actually starts with a sourdough starter just to save you a day. Once you've started making it, you can keep teff starter as your starter, and you can migrate it to 100% teff. Even if you're doing it with a sourdough starter, it's still 90% teff. It's a little easier if you use all-purpose flour because it gives you more protein to work with. So the thing is, you're kind of desperately trying to hydrate all these teff starch granules, which is why you pour all this extra water on top of it, so there's no chance it won't 100%, you won't get maximum hydration, and then you save that, which people often call hooch. And then you boil a little bit of it, not just to stop the fermentation process and keep it from getting too sour, but you're actually pre-gelatinizing the starch granules the same way like French would do in a choux pastry.
Right.
So like that is my very, very technical explanation.
No, I love that. And that's what ultimately gives it something. It gives it a body to actually cook when you put it in the pan. Okay.
Yeah, because then you're pouring it like a batter, and then you pour it and you immediately cover it, so it's like you're making a steamed pancake.
Right. Ooh.
Yeah, and getting the timing right is still a pain in the ass.
Yeah. Okay. So like in my head, I'm like, okay, so Wonder Flour is like pre-gelatinized.
Exactly. It's very, very similar. Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, maybe you could do something with that with like a crepe thing, but that's my head going somewhere else.
No, that's completely. I mean, that's a good way to make things like polenta bread forever, where you're going to pre-cook. Once again, you're taking the polenta and pre-cooking it, so you're pre-gelatinizing the starch in that case. So
that's super cool. Okay, well, so you guys do the dinners, and the dinners are what? What do you guys do? Like, describe to the listeners what happens during the dinner. We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. So it's pretty simple. We basically we sell tickets and people come, and as the dishes come out, we come out and we discuss the history and the food history of the time. So what we're trying to achieve is this moment, and you see it in people's faces occasionally when people are like, they form that actual connection to human history, to their past, whether even if they're not, directly linearly descended from, whatever time we're doing, people have ideas about this past, which are often really wrong, which is one of the things like I really strive to do is say, some of these things you've heard. And I mean, obviously my personal favorite is probably, and I've heard this so many times. I actually heard this on a reputable history podcast the other day. Someone saying that, they used spices in the Middle Ages to cover up the flavor of rotten meat.
Yeah.
Which is funny for a bunch of reasons. The simplest one being that like those, no one was being served. Anyone who's being served meat is noble, right? That's a really rich person who has meat. And no one who is eating that way is eating alone. They're eating with their court and their retainers and stuff. So they're slaughtering a bull and eating it for a couple of days, or sheep very commonly, and they're cooking it for everyone, and it's all getting eaten. And the nutmeg that they might flavor it with, or the black pepper, that nutmeg, which came, from the Spice Islands, or allspice, comes from Spice Islands, across the sea to India, across the desert to maybe Alexandria, and then like across the sea again to Venice, and now it has to go across medieval Europe to get to England across the sea. So the notion that which costs more than the ox that you would be eating, is being used to cover up the ox is absurd. It's kind of charmingly absurd, but
I've fallen into that. It points to, sure. And it's only been through this podcast that like, I remember reading something being like, oh yeah, that would be like me taking like, a week-old chicken and taking a gold brick and just shaving the gold brick on the chicken.
Right.
Like, yeah, it's silly. I mean, it had its place because, just the refrigeration anyway stuff was kind of gamey. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that was virtually no, they did have cold rooms. And then, what's interesting is even by like the 16th century, you have cookbooks that are starting with actual instructions about how to set up a kitchen and what things you should have and how you should have a colder place and a warmer place and water and cleanliness and stuff. And when I say the 16th century, I mean the 16th century in Europe, because they were doing all that in the 10th century in Baghdad, So
yeah, of course they were doing it. Yeah. So you guys do courses. How many courses normally?
It's usually about 5 or 6, depending. Wow. I usually do some kind of dessert trio-y thing. I mean, dessert also, like, we do massage, ancient eating habits into a modern, service à la française. I'm sorry, service à la russe. I'm losing my ever-loving mind. A coursed dinner, which is service à la, like Russian service, with some small starters, and then things in the middle that are big, and then desserts at the end.
Yeah,
but that's certainly not like dessert. Really wasn't a thing for most cultures and most human histories. Well,
it's like, it's one of the things that was really funny. Like reading your book, you're like, yeah, everything we're cooking here is basically rich people food, because if we tried to make the food of just the common people, it's all going to be gruel.
Exactly.
And I was like, yeah, I mean, everybody eats rice, gruel, everybody eats potatoes. Yeah, it's all starchy, watery, trying to get the most bang for your buck out of the shit you're just pulling out of the fields.
Like, I mean, also, if you think about the fact that I'm working from original documentation, right? So I'm working from a book. And throughout most of history, a book is an extraordinarily high status object. It's incredibly expensive. A lot of these books were handwritten by literate
before the
people.
Gutenberg,
Yeah. So it's like, and I mean, it does make you ask a really funny question, which is, who are these books written for, actually?
I've always thought that they were more historical books than they were texts for other cooks. There were some other, like, you had, like, back in the day, like, you had guys like Pliny the Elder, who was like just bananas fucking crazy.
Yeah.
But I think he literally was like, all right, this is how you take some dog piss, put it in a wrap, and put it around your head, and the humors in your brain will go away the next day. You'll feel better. But also, this is my favorite way to eat olives. Like he would just throw them there as asides. But also,
because he was writing a medical text,
right? But
for
I think
people
he also
to learn.
cared about food. Like he was
absolutely.
like a dude that you could tell cared about food.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the source of, these ideas about humoral medicine that all foods are hot or cold or wet or dry, and
right.
that human health and human personality,
which there is a section in your book about that too.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to. It informs. You would be surprised by the cuisines today that are actually you still see vestiges of humoral medicine. Although one of my favorite things about humoral medicine, weirdly enough, is not just this funny notion. Like, so the idea is like, if you had a, choleric personality and you're very hot tempered, right? That means your blood is, you're too hot inside, right?
Right.
So you should balance that out by eating cold foods,
Yeah.
But not necessarily foods that were physically cold, but foods that had like amazing cold properties. But there's this funny period, particularly like in the High Middle Ages, where the one magical spice that cures everything, like the one thing that cures everything, is white refined sugar.
Oh.
Which today people are like, like right, it's the devil, but it's like, remember that sugar has this incredibly long history that starts. I mean, I actually thought it was in India, and I was recently disabused, but that was like the first major place where it was majorly farmed. They had, was sugarcane in India, and they have, jaggery, which is raw sugar. But it wasn't until that sugar entered the Arab world and kind of Arab alchemists started purifying it, that they were actually able to form this refined white sugar, which seems like almost like a gemstone. It seems very magical if you look at it through a 13th century lens.
Yeah.
And then by the time this has traveled from, the Arab world once again across the sea through, through to medieval Europe, and it's just phenomenally expensive. It's not that surprising. People thought this stuff was just magical. So it's pretty, I don't know.
Yeah, because you also you probably get a pretty good sugar high off of it too. If you eat enough of it, and it probably oh shit, this does a thing, just a little bit,
a little bit. Yeah. It's,
and seeing it, cause sugar, I guess at the time, what were they using for sugar? Like beets and,
actually beet sugar, actual beet sugar doesn't actually come until I think the 19th century, weirdly enough. I think Napoleon was actually heavily invested, so 18th century, but heavily invested in the production of beet sugar. Partially because he was cut off from the rest of Europe by the British, by blockades, but honey and grape must, like concentrated grape juice was a big, concentrated apple juice, but all those things have very specific dominant flavors.
Sure.
And a lot of those are also only exist as liquids.
Right.
So even, so
they're colored.
Yeah.
Like, you add sugar to things, it doesn't discolor it.
Right. It's it's the very neutral thing, which in certain
we don't think
probably prized.
We don't think, one of the things that your book actually got me thinking was just the actual mind-blowing miracle that is our pantry.
It's insane. You know?
I'm even 100 years ago, right? I mean, shit, in America, even 30 years ago, for some of this stuff.
I remember when I was a kid, a lot of these things, so many things I have in my pantry you could not have gotten when I was a child.
Can't get Zatar in 1985. That wasn't a thing.
Or fish sauce. You have to go to that crazy Asian market. They eat dogs probably or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just
insane. Oh yeah. Also, by the way, MSG is going to kill you. So
exactly. Like that. Boy, don't even get me started on that. That one really bothers me. But I mean, I think the funny thing also is to remember that the number of things, particularly spices, in your pantry that are the genesis for innovation, and I always say this, but if you think about the fact that it almost any given time until maybe very recently in human history, the single most technologically complex thing on the planet was an ocean-going vessel,
Yeah.
And so many things about those things were developed for the spice trade to bring black pepper to Europe. Insurance was invented. Corporations were invented. Joint stock companies were invented to bring pepper also on these crazy, crazy tiny boats. 60-foot long carracks that are going 16,000 miles where a quarter of the people are going to die.
Yeah, easy.
It's totally crazy.
Yeah, it's bananas. Well, okay. Speaking of just like spices or ingredients, what was there anything in the research for this book that you discovered that you didn't know about, like spice wise?
My favorite,
or ingredient wise?
Yeah, no, my favorite spice thing from the book. Actually, there's two. One is this herb called silphium.
Okay.
Which is in ancient Roman cuisine, and it was fundamental to ancient Roman cuisine. It was like incredibly prized. It was extraordinarily expensive. It appeared on coins, and it was the basis for some like regions, whole like financial system because it was so valuable. And no one really knows what it is because it's extinct.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But we do know what it was close to. So it's probably close to asafoetida, which is, that spice that gives Indian food, that pungency that there's no other way to describe, that has almost like this wonderful.
It's like a resinous.
Yeah, this resinous function. And it's actually made from the root of the plant that you cut and you dry the sap and grind it.
Right.
And that was also the way that you would get the flavor compounds from silphium. So it's possibly vaguely related, but there's a lot of like academics who like to argue about these things, like to argue about this one particularly, but no one really knows because it's extinct.
And it's also called laser, right?
Yes, precisely. Laser root.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. That's laser root. That sounds fucking rad.
Pretty awesome. There was briefly a 40-ounce beer called Laser that we had a can of around the house and no one would drink. But like, look, you could drink some.
But Laser. It looks awesome. Yeah.
It was very cool. The other one is this. I probably mispronounce everything, so I apologize to the rest of humanity. In ancient Arab cooking, both in Baghdad and in Andalusian Spain, which was Arab for 500 years. There's a really ubiquitous spice called muri. It's a condiment. And it's a dry ferment of barley. Where you basically would take barley and you'd wrap it in grape leaves because grape leaves have a bunch of naturally occurring yeasts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you would leave it for a couple months and then you'd wet it and leave it for a bit and it would get moldy and you eventually end up with this kind of thick soy sauce like paste.
Yeah, it was like after like 6 months at least.
It's like 6 months.
Yeah.
And I did not have time to actually ferment my own. I did.
How dare you?
I did actually speak to a number of food scientists specifically about this, and we actually talked a bunch about like what the chemistry of that probably would look like, which is how I ended up with the workaround. That's in the book, which is, I'll tell you up front, is actually a combination of like soy sauce.
Yes, it was soy sauce and what is it? Oh, Marmite, right?
Exactly right. Yes. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Marmite actually, because it's actually this, it was originally leftover from the brewing process. It's like beer leaves, basically. Marmite is in fact, boy, everyone's going to steal this from me. It's the secret ingredient in this. I kind of make my own booze.
Oh, okay.
So I was drinking all these really alcohol forward, very sweet cocktails, often with like Benedictine or like Drambuie. And I love those kind of like really weird herbal.
Same here.
And I'm like, these are expensive.
Yeah.
So I recently have started doing production runs of my own. I basically do a kind of a complex infusion into honey and water, and then I strip everything out. There's a lot of ingredients, and I just mix it with like Polish grain alcohol.
Okay.
And I make my own little aperitif, and it's just lovely.
Oh, that's cool. What is it? What does it taste like? What would you like?
It tastes like a very sweet aperitif. It has a lot of bitter notes, and it has a lot of spice notes. You can definitely, there's, some of the things, there's, star anise and fennel and, the kind of standard herbs, and there's a lot of other stuff, but it has this bitter undertone that's actually got a fair amount of Marmite in it, which is, it's always fun to give it to people and have them try to guess. And people are like, is there soy sauce in this? Like, what could you possibly, But no, it's Marmite, which is, it's cool. Just a great, it's also a great, when you're trying to sneak some umami into something that you want to keep vegetarian or vegan.
Sure.
Like I often put, like when I make terrines and stuff, I'll often sneak fish sauce into them.
Sure.
Because it just gives it that kind of umami kick. But, if you want, that kind of same bottom note, Marmite's a good,
but vegetarian.
Yeah, but right. But it's vegan. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Oh yeah, vegan. You're right. Yeah. Yeah, it was funny because last week we were talking about that for something. I had friends that live in England that were in town, and we were talking about something about Marmite and Vegemite, and we were looking it up, and I was like, oh yeah, they're both vegan.
Like, yeah, they're totally vegan. They were developed as like a health aid also. Like they're super like vitamin rich and
right. Like and the big thing is to put it on like buttered toast.
Yeah,
right? Like,
it's really nice on buttered toast.
It's all right. Like
I don't know. You just gotta like get.
I like it too. I always pump up soups with it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And I always go, all right, let's try it again. And I taste it. And I'm like, yeah, it tastes like Marmite. It's good. Yeah. Let me see. Oh, okay. This is an easy one. So like you're going through and you're researching all this stuff, and you're saying the one like the injera took you like 15 so times. Like how are you like how long did the book from beginning to end kind of take? It seems like it should have taken a while, right?
It probably took like a year.
Oh wow,
year and a half, something like that. I mean, I'd done, like the Tudor chapter and the Silk Road chapter. I'd already worked out a lot of those recipes.
For the dinners.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And some of the New York ones we had done. Pardon me. We had done dinners at the James Beard Foundation.
Oh, okay.
Which at one point was like a bucket list thing of mine.
Yeah,
I've always kind of dreamed of cooking there, and I've actually done 3 now, and
that's cool.
Hope to do more. We're not really doing the dinners anymore. It's like we've kind of moved on to other, to other things. I'm kind of going in different directions. I'm working on a more general cookery book for smart people.
Okay. Yeah.
But there's a kind of a funny space that I keep seeing, like, there's another book out there for me. So
that's cool. Yeah. It's the one thing that I was like, by the way, anybody listening to this, go out and get the book. Cause it really is, so the only other comparative thing that I have, at least in my, bookshelf right now is do you have the Salvador Dali book?
Yes. Yeah. And like and the Futurist cooking book.
There's so much like it's so impregnable, and so like no one is ever cooking anything out of that, right?
Right.
But like your book has some of those where some of them people are going to look at and be like, no fucking way am I even trying that. Like one, where am I going to find a larding needle, right? Which actually isn't really hard to find.
Yeah.
But there are accessible, there's a lot of accessible recipes, but on top of that, the stories and the insight and the asides, like it's really fun to go through.
Thanks.
And it's not something that if you give a shit about cooking, it's not going to be my Salvador Dali book.
Right.
Which I go through when I'm just like, you know what? Let me crack this weird fucking thing open. It's that book is nuts, right? Yeah. The pictures are crazy. It's a great moment of time, but this is like a living text of history, and it's really, really cool.
Thank you so much.
I keep going back to that, but it's. I was surprised at how much I really, really found myself reading it. Like just as a fun, not like, okay, I got to prepare for the thing. It's like, oh, well, I got 10 minutes. Like, fuck,
it should be a fun, like, I certainly wanted my parts to be a fun book. I feel like it's a book that you can crack open and find a funny thing and be like, really? Wow. Life is weird. Yeah. Like that was kind of my goals. I wanted people to have some, not just connection to history, but like if there's one, in a funny way, the one thing that I hope is really illustrated. I think a lot of the time it's very easy to think of people in the past as like stupid, and like I feel like, or just like not, they're uneducated and they're so primitive, right? And I think this is the thing that offends me, weirdly enough, about like ancient alien shows, and all that kind of stuff, because the subtext of so many things is always like, oh, people back then were way too stupid to do stuff. Right? They must have had aliens helping them. Like, no, people are amazing. Like, human beings are so goddamn smart. You know, they figured out how to build pyramids with logs and fire, and it's just like totally amazing. So a lot of time, some of the reasons that I include some of the more crazy and spectacular dishes, is to demonstrate the sophistication of people even 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, because there's a real relationship between the sophistication of one's cuisine and the sophistication of one's culture.
Yeah.
Like funny example. Once again, I'm going to go back to 10th century Baghdad because it's just so effing cool. But so there's a recipe in there where you take a very large fish and you're cooking it simultaneously 3 different ways. And you do this by wrapping the center section in multiple folds of oiled cloth. And then on the tail section, you put a very thin layer of very heavily oiled cloth. And then you put it in a very hot tandoor oven, right? Which is kind of like an Indian tandoor oven, but the same thing they use, and the head roasts and the middle part poaches and the tail fries. Right. It's also using the different heat levels within the oven. And I actually add a technique that I kind of cribbed from like Chinese cooking, where you finish the tail again with boiling oil. You can do table side if you want. There's also, you think that's crazy, there's another one where you first take the skin off and you make a force meat out of all the thing, and you put it back together with reeds to hold it together, and now you're making the stuffed version of the fish.
You make a force meat out of what?
Out of all the fish meat, and spices and additional.
So you're making like a giant
stuff.
Fish nugget.
Yeah, you're making a giant like gefilte fish, and then you're still cooking it simultaneously. You put the skin back on, and you tie it around these reeds so it holds its shape. And this is super
cool.
This is really
that's high level
sophisticated food, Yeah, and these are not. I mean, Baghdad
castles are very complicated things to build without them falling over.
Exactly.
Especially with like, dungeons and the refrigeration room. But the one thing that I, reading the book that I tried to put myself into was the I guess the kitchen of the cook who was making this, like trying to imagine what that would look like, how dark or how lit up, or they got braziers going, and like how big the room was or how small it was. And
I think it really
big.
I think it really I think it really changes, from one situation to the next. I would say for most of the kitchens we're discussing this book, and for example, Hampton Court Palace, like Henry VIII's kitchen is still extant. You can just go and they actually do very, very cool stuff there. But the thing to remember, and I'm very upfront about this, is that these were big kitchens with a lot of staff, usually producing a lot of these meals.
And a couple dogs
would have been been produced for 100 people, 200 people, sometimes 500 people. They had huge staffs. They were going through huge amounts of products. But I mean, the funny thing, people will often ask me, but your recipe says put it in a food pro, and they didn't have food pros in fast. Like, if you want to do it in mortar and pestle, that's totally fine. And I actually have made certain things like the actual old-fashioned way just to kind of torture myself.
Sure.
But I think the thing to keep in mind is
why now? Like, unless
exactly.
you want to, if you're a cook that wants to learn it that way, you do it like once, right? Like I've made hot dogs like once or twice in my life, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's fucking brutal.
You do not want to do some of those things. But once again, if you were the master chef who was, you wouldn't be doing that stuff. Like,
no, you're telling everybody,
like throughout human history, the primary labor saving device was the slave or indentured servant. Going back to Rome, it's very, very common. And they still had stuff for like, wow, we've invented this new thing. My personal favorite progression of labor saving devices is that in the Middle Ages, when spit roasting was like really the thing, and it was actually incredibly sophisticated, these very sophisticated hearths with spits that rotated. First there was a someone whose job was the spit boy, and that was a boy who would sit next to the hearth and turn the crank on the thing, and that's just horrendous.
Brutal.
You're next to something.
You're cooking a child.
Yeah, it's like you're sitting right next to something that's hot enough to cook the thing.
Yeah.
Somehow, without cooking yourself, you're kind of around the corner. And then someone came up with this incredible innovation. It was brilliant, right? And they would put
included what?
They would have a dog in a small box. You know this one. That was attached to a treadmill that was attached to the spit. And that was the cool mod con in like 16th century. And then that was eventually, that was replaced by a clockwork one. You could actually wind it up and go. And that's amazing to me.
I love the thought of one chef going into another chef's kitchen and being like, you still use children? Ugh.
Exactly.
We have dogs. Get with it, fucking Philistine.
It's so. I mean, it's like the guy who goes is like, oh, or the other way around. The guy goes, oh man, look at that new immersion circulator he has.
Yeah,
that's so cool. I want to get one of those dogs in a box.
Yeah, it's like, oh man, I want a dog on a treadmill. Come on. And then he's got to write it up and propose it to the king.
And the king's like, you want what?
Yeah,
my boy isn't good enough for you. I bought you 10 of those.
Yeah, and I've gone through 8 of them. They've cooked themselves to death. They died at 7.
Yeah, it's just fun. History's awesome.
Let's get into the big thing and the giant monster of your cookbook, right?
The Cockathrice, is that what
the Cockathrice?
It's kind of my if I have a signature dish, it is probably that. And the Cockathrice is a mythical animal that Henry VIII loved to eat. And it actually, before they made the food thing, he was with things like a hippogriff. It was like a partially this and partially that. But what it is, it doesn't actually specify which end. I always do the front end of a pig sewed to the back end of a chicken, or if I'm doing it nowadays, I do a turkey because they're bigger, and you get them alive, so you get them with the feet on, so that it looks even more terrifying. And you stuff this with more ground meat and spices and dried fruits, and you often would paint it green with vegetable pigments.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, I didn't in the book. I thought it looked so nice the way it looked.
Did you put the wings on the back of the pig?
Yes, and that is my personal flourish.
It's great.
It looks so good. Shout out to Victoria Granoff, our food stylist on that one, who is totally amazing.
Oh, that's the other thing. The pictures are awesome.
Yeah, the photography is so beautiful. The photographic team just did such a good job. Lucy Schaefer and Victoria Granoff, shout out to them. Tremendous.
You got fucking Jessica B. Harris right in the forward for the fucking book. For those who don't know, Jessica B. Harris is like legendary.
Yeah, we were so
legendary food historian.
We were amazed. It's funny. She was very, very busy, and we'd asked her to write it, and she was like, "I'm too busy, and I could write you a little blurb for the back." We're like, "Great," because Jessica Harrison, and we sent her a copy of the book, and she emailed us back and went, I just can't get this down to a blurb. I'll write, I'll write. And
that's super cool.
I was over the moon. I was so happy.
So back to the Cockathrice, it's so nuts to look at. And also there is a pig earlier in the book.
Yeah.
That is pig. Roasted with like sausages hanging out of it. Like its guts.
So that's Trimalchio's pig. That's actually directly from literature. That is drawn from Petronius. It's in the Rome section of the book.
Yeah,
it's drawn from Petronius's Satyricon, which is the first satirical novel, and some people consider it the first novel. There's actually a great Fellini film of it.
Yeah, Fellini Satyricon. Right.
Precisely, yeah. And there's one story in the book that's definitely it's like a roast of like a nouveau riche, up and coming rich guy, basically. And he's making fun of him, and his name is Trimalchio, and he has this very, very elaborate banquet, and it's really, Romans have this really funny relationship to their food, and particularly fancy food, because Romans had this vision of themselves as this, really martial culture. And they often, thought about, the reason they'd conquered the world was that they were so tough and, self-denying and stuff. And then they'd go, yeah, but we're like eating all this rich food. Is that making us weak? Is that like sapping our vital essence?
Seeing it as the downfall of Western civilization.
Exactly. Which you see this trope today. So then they would keep passing what are called sumptuary laws, which limit they would ban the private ownership of fish ponds, or the number of courses you could have at a banquet, or what you could wear, and then they would immediately like break all the rules immediately. They would make these laws and break the laws. So Trimalchio is this nouveau riche plebe, whatever you want to call it, that they're going to make fun of. It's elaborate banquets, with dormice, bathed in honey and stuff. And the famous story is, so his chef brings him out this roasted pig, and he cuts open the pig, and the intestines of the pig spill out onto the table. And Trimalchio is furious that he's going to have the cook executed. And the cook then says, "Wait, but stop, look." And he cuts the intestines, and they're these delicate sausages. So we have a picture of that,
and everybody was like, "Holy shit, that's amazing!"
I've actually done that one live in front of a whole bunch of people, and it's really fun.
It's a very graphic, it's a great like it's not shocking, but it's such a great presentation that's would be shocking to some people.
It's really fun to do.
It's not shocking to me, but when I saw it, I was like, that's fucking great.
Yeah, I was really happy on that one. Those little ones, little things really make you happy,
Yeah, it's so fun, and the Cockathrice is so fun. Just that is total. Are you sewing that?
Yeah.
Butcher twine, or
I'm using butcher twine is usually too big to make it look. You can do it, make it look really nice.
Because then it'll look like Frankenstein.
Yeah, there's a story in the book about when I first had to go. I went to a notion shop, and I'm looking for a really big curved needle to sew something, and they're finally like, "Look, sir, what are you trying to sew?" And I was like, "Well, let me explain this to you." So I use a thinner but all cotton twine, and I have a kind of a complex. Gotcha. It's cool to see how you actually do it, because to make it stronger, you actually undersew first the ribs of the two animals together, and you reflect back the skin things, and then you basically use an understitch, the way you would be hiding the seam of a shoe.
Holy cow! Yeah.
And I looked up both how to do shoe repair, and I actually had a friend who is a general surgeon who I talked to about it, and it was funny. He's like, I see butchers, and it's not. surgeons are obviously amazing, and he was clearly joking, but he's like, it's not that, you're cutting stuff, you're separating stuff, you're trying to keep stuff intact. And
right.
He gave me some hints on anatomy.
Well, it looks great. The feet definitely are the kicker.
Yeah, it's
the wings. They're so cool.
The problem, of course, is you have to go to a live poultry place to get a bird with the feet still on there.
Oh yeah, I guess so, huh?
Because they don't sell them in the stores that way. But
okay, so I got a couple more questions,
sure,
so we can get out of here. Okay, this is my biggest question for you, and it's going to be hard. Should poetry be added back into cookbooks?
I think that we were just having a big conversation about poetry, like my friend and I the other day. Yes.
I agree.
Yeah, that's it. It can be slam poetry, it can be whatever. I think there's a place for poetry in the world in general.
To give the listeners a backstory, in the book, some of the cookbooks that you guys were using as source text were full of poetry.
Yeah, basically this one that's like, I think it's the greatest cookbook ever written in the history of the world, which is, the Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen from Baghdad in the 10th century. And this is a period when, 300 years later, cookbooks in Europe are going to be, take this and this and this and cook it and serve it forth. And there's going to be like 50 recipes, and that's just going to be the whole cookbook. This book, it's this massive tome. First of all, it has like 500 recipes. It's divided into sections. It has weights and measures. It makes sense. It has troubleshooting. Yeah. It tells you how to set up a kitchen. It tells you all the things you should buy. It tells you how to choose foods. And
that's amazing.
It is incredible.
Detail. Yeah.
But Western cookbooks won't come close to this until
1970.
No, 15, 16
well, no, I mean,
or so.
Still even up
which
until
is
the
500
70s.
years, though.
Still up until the 70s, you have take a thing, like there are no times. They're like, cook it till, distributed together. Like, it's so vague.
No, the Italian Renaissance does have one that's like, that I'd say is the first real modern. Some people argue there's the other one that's 1465, but I would say it's like 1560 is when you start to really get something that's close.
That's amazing. Like,
but it's also these are the people who at the same time were inventing algebra. So
exactly. But he was including poetry into the book.
But the other thing about that book is it also has stories and poems, because poetry is still much more respected in the Arab world, than in the Western world. Like, it still has, like, people still respond to it and think of it as like a vital, important thing. And people still never like write dueling political poems about each other, and they get into big, flame wars on, in verse, which is totally awesome.
Yeah. So, well, we just had that with Drake and
true. Yeah.
The other guy. I don't.
So once again, we're catching up. That's all it comes down to. Like, once again, we're catching up. So, no, but that book is just an extraordinary object. It's
I'm gonna have to look that book up because it sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it blew my mind. Yeah,
that's super cool. Okay, last regular question.
Okay,
out of everything in the book, what is your favorite recipe? Like, what was your favorite thing that, like, even you think like years from now you'll go back and keep cooking?
Okay. The one I'm going to keep cooking, and it's funny, I've asked this before and it always is the same answer. Like, there's other recipes that are my favorite recipe for different reasons, also because they were like such an utter nightmare, or like so difficult. But, and again, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but the vinegared stew from 10th century Baghdad, which is called sikbajat, which I'm probably mispronouncing, as I say, is... I love stews and braises. It's like my favorite thing. Like, because you transform a cheap cut of meat into something incredibly flavorful and unctuous and delicious. And I have a pretty sour palate, but that has this fragrant, sweet and sour. It's like heavily vinegared, but it also has a sugar syrup in it. It's complex. it's really delicious. And it's the most beloved dish of 10th century Baghdad. And like I always like to say, there's a story about sikbajat, but there's like a bunch of stories. And let me tell you at least one. Here, I'll tell you. Yeah. So the shortest one is that the Caliph had a cooking competition, and he invited his courtiers to come around and to cook the thing they cook best in their favorite dish, and everybody cooked sikbajat. And the funny part is no one was surprised. My other favorite story about it has a story. It also has chess players in it, which is why it's cool. Not my favorite story about food and chess, but we won't go there yet. But there was this group of chess players, and one day they were lucky enough to have the Caliph's cook come visit them, and they said, "Oh, wonderful Caliph's cook, cook us, some amazing dish because you're amazing, right?" And he's like, "Well, who normally cooks for you?" And like, "Oh, our young servant boy usually cooks for us." And they're like, "Okay, so what does he usually cook?" And they're like, "Well, he cooks sikbajat." And he says, "Okay, kid, bring me the vessel that you cook it in." Right. And all this is in the book. There's a whole long story in the cookbook. And he's like, and the kid brings him a vessel. And he's like, "Okay, now take it away and clean it really well." And the kid does, and he brings it back. And he says, "Now scrub it out with clay and clean it again." And the kid does, and he brings it back. He says, "Now take it away and scrub it and rub it with sweet herbs." And you can see where this is going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the kid comes back and he shows it and he smells it. He says, "Okay, it's actually clean now. Cook the sikbajat as you normally would." And the kid does, and he brings it back, and everyone pronounces it the most delicious dish they've ever had.
Right.
And this is it strikes me that this is precisely the kind of apocryphal story that you hear in like Michelin-starred kitchens today.
Yeah, of course. That's
like
hilarious.
Alice Waters and the olive oil.
Yeah. Okay. We're at the end.
Marvelous.
Unfortunately, tomorrow you're going to die. So I hate to tell you this. I'm the bearer of bad news. I'm so sorry. But you have a chance to eat whatever you want, as much as you want. Drink as much as you want. How many courses? Whatever you want. As soon as you think of it, it pops up and you can have it. What is your last meal?
Nah, that's a tricky one. So like
it can be as simple or as you can go anywhere with it.
I think the truth, as tempting as it is to construct some incredibly elaborate tasting menu.
Sure.
I feel like if that really was the case and I was going to die, I just feel there's something too precious about that in a way. And it would probably be, well, if it was going to be a banquet, it would be a classical Chinese one.
Okay.
It would be like watching one of those things from this amazing TV show called A Bite of China, which is made by Chinese TV, but it's incredibly beautiful. Or all of these would have like very wonderful cocktail pairings. However, this is my caveat. In either case, these would have cocktail pairings of my own. In my mind, I would be able to ask great bartenders, "Give me something like this for each course," and they would, knowing what the course was, American barbecue.
Nice. Okay.
There's just nothing like dry rub beef ribs.
Beef ribs,
some short ribs, some hot links. That's it.
It's hard to find good beef ribs.
It's really hard to find good beef ribs, but they're just transcendent when they nail it right.
Dude, when they're cooked right.
So
it really is.
Yeah, that used to be like my thing. Like on my birthday, I would go to a barbecue restaurant and get a beef rib.
That's funny.
That would be one of the.
My birthday is coming up next week, and I am going to treat myself to a triple chili dog.
Marvelous.
A triple foot-long chili dog, by the way.
I'm a fan. I was a big fan of Pink's in Los Angeles back when I used to live there.
They deep fry the hot dogs first. The place has been around since 1930 something.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I envy you that.
It's like I get it 2 times a year at the most. But it's always a birthday thing that I give myself. I completely understand what you're saying.
Marvelous.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate it. This was awesome.
That was so much fun.
Yeah. Can you let everybody know where to go to find you, find the book, all that?
The book is sold in, everywhere fine books are sold, especially, Amazon and Barnes and Noble. But if you have a good local bookseller, particularly a culinary bookseller, buy it there, make their lives better.
Absolutely.
You can find me on Instagram at Jay Reifel. You can find me at jayreifel.com, JAYREIFEL.com. Reach out to me. Say hi. Ask me cooking questions. I'm trying to figure out what people are thinking. So
cool.
Hit me up. I'm out there.
Yeah. You got a website?
Yeah, jayreifel.com.
Jayreifel.com. Yeah. Cool, man. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate coming on and sharing with the audience some of what I've been reading for the past week and a half, and it's been awesome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, man. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the Rude Cooking School podcast. You can find us anywhere that you're currently listening to your podcast at, but if you could take the time to rate and review us, that would be great. Just star it or rate it, review it, tell a friend, tell a dog, tell your family, tell a child while he's roasting, turning the spit roast in your kitchen. Word of mouth is how we get around, and we appreciate it. Also, we have a Facebook group. Please add yourself to that. It is giant, and it is the only place that is worth going on Facebook because everyone is super nice and answers everyone's cooking questions and shares stupid memes and has a good time. Come join us. And that's it. Thank you for listening to the Rude Cooking School podcast. My name's John Hauser III. Don't yuck my yum. And your name is?
And I'm Jay Reifel.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week, and peace.